Deputy Speaker. There is some of the contribution just made by the member for Bowman which I agree with. And to some extent, I agree with his core argument that I think he was just trying to put, that when we are faced with people expressing anti-scientific and false information and putting it out into the community, then it is incumbent on people who have been elected to this parliament as leaders of the community to address that. As I understand it, that was at the core of the member's proposition. And that is absolutely correct, and unfortunately hasn't been done enough until recently. But where I do take issue was the member for Bowman illustrating his own point that personally attacking others without knowing what you're talking about is a bad way to go about persuading people by personally attacking a member of the chamber without knowing what he was talking about. I did intend, and I will return to in my contribution, to speak about the way debate about the vaccine has caused me to reflect on a theme that I've spoken about a number of times in this chamber, as have many of my colleagues, and it's a theme that I know is pretty dear to the heart of the member for Warringah, about what makes good politics and good politicians and how people should behave. And I will return to that. And to some extent it flows from the slightly contradictory contribution from the member for Bowman. But I just want to say a few things about immunisation, because the contributions before the most recent one, or some of the most recent one, were thoughtful and considered contributions by members of this parliament from both sides of the chamber, Liberal and Labor, about the importance of science and particularly importance of immunisation, and proud contributions about the world-leading role that Australia has played for many decades, many decades now, in the field of public health. And I often come into this chamber to listen to the member for Macarthur, Dr Freelander, make contributions on legislation issues that relate to the medical profession and public health, because when he raises concerns and when he also praises legislation, you can be sure that it is a thoughtful and valid contribution that comes from someone who's not only had extensive previous experience in the medical profession, but continues to practice while he also serves his community and this nation. And I want to take the opportunity really to adopt a lot of what Dr Freelander said, because I certainly couldn't say it any better. And I also want to do what the member for Macarthur did, and put on the record that I will be taking the COVID vaccine as soon as I am able to, and I am appropriately reached in the queue of priorities. I've been vaccinated for the flu. Because of my particular health circumstances, I've also had the pneumonia vaccine. I've spoken to my GP about suitability of the COVID vaccine for me in my particular medical circumstances, and she's assured me I can take it, so I will be taking it. And when I have spoken on social media or publicly about the need to call out conspiracy theories and to assure the Australian public that Australia's TGA process and our vaccine rollout is safe and robust, I've been asked a number of times, well, would you take the vaccine then? And so I want to make it abundantly clear that the answer is yes. Of course it's yes. And of course this legislation is mandatory for the register, but not making taking the vaccination mandatory. But I join with the Minister for Health and the Shadow Minister for Health and every reasonable thinking, science-believing person in this chamber and encourage all Australians to also take the vaccine. It's not a magic bullet. It's not going to mean that we are, as a community and as a country, all safe from COVID and that the borders are all going to open and we can travel overseas, and some of the things that we are all desperately waiting to happen. But it is a really important step. You know, people that are 10, 15, 20 years younger than me probably have no idea what polio was. You know, but we had a former leader of the Labor Party who had polio as a child. It effectively doesn't exist, certainly in this country. I remember as a young child having a mumps reaction and having to go to hospital for an operation and having to be put in isolation because my sister had rubella, measles. That effectively doesn't happen in this country anymore in just well, I was going to say a few decades, quite a few decades since I was a child, because of vaccines. You know, it's really important that the sentiments that have been expressed by government and opposition and crossbench members of this place continue to be expressed. It's a significant public health issue for COVID, but more broadly. I want to endorse the rollout of the vaccine and endorse the statements of the Shadow Minister for Health that, of course, we want to see this vaccine rolled out as quickly as possible, as safely as possible. We want to make sure that the most vulnerable get access first. We want to make sure that Australians know that the process of the rollout is happening in a methodical way, that doctors and pharmacists and staff at nursing homes, disability support services are assured that the rollout of the vaccine will be efficient. I hope that there are 4 million vaccines rolled out by the end of March. But I also hope that the rollout would start in January, as the Minister for Health said in September of last year, and we haven't seen that happen. So I just caution the government, every time you say that something's going to happen and it doesn't, that adds to the feelings of concern in the general public and undermines just that little bit faith in the government and its ability to roll out this really important public health measure. So it's important that the information that is given, not just from random backbenchers, but from the Minister for Health and the Prime Minister, is as accurate as it can be every time and is about public policy and not about politics, because this should not be about politics. I just want to finish my contribution, as I said, by just reflecting a little bit on how the debate that we've been engaged in for quite some time now, and really, unfortunately, we appear to have inherited from America and from some of the really dangerous trends that emerged under the Trump regime, can go to undermining the community's faith in politics and democracy and government. And we know that before the COVID pandemic hit, trust in politics and trust in government had declined over the previous 2 decades disastrously, and less than half of the Australian public expressed trust in politics and politicians. And we really needed to work hard to regain that trust. And there are a lot of really decent people in this parliament who want to do that. And what we have seen, because of the way the state governments and the federal government have cooperated most of the time, apart from perhaps the way the federal government talked about Victoria for a while, but we'll put that aside, during the pandemic, is that there has been a return of trust. And the most recent surveys and the most recent polling would suggest that Australians are now expressing a trust in government and politicians that hasn't been seen for a long time. And one of the challenges, the really important challenges that we face as parliamentarians, and it doesn't matter whether we're in government or opposition, as parliamentarians, is to gently hold that trust and retain it. And it is one of the silver linings, perhaps, of one of the most disastrous periods in Australia's recent history, that we have that opportunity to try to gently hold that trust and retain it and build it. And part of doing that is the way in which we individually and as political parties conduct ourselves as parliamentarians. The member for Moreton's contribution, he talked about how he had used his social media to inform his community during the COVID lockdowns of the new restrictions and the new measures. And that's absolutely what I did as the member for Dunkley, and I know that it's absolutely what most of the members of this parliament did. When we couldn't go out to see our constituents, when there were no community events, when our constituents couldn't come to us, whether we like social media or not, it became the lifeline of communication. And when, for those of us who lived through weeks and weeks and months of lockdown, and so did our communities, when we experienced that, we know that people were on social media in numbers and at volume that they weren't before, because that's where they went to get information, because it was spontaneous. And so those of us who had thought about it and wanted to be part of building trust and serving our communities treated our social media in much the same way that we would treat this parliament. We tried to treat it with respect. We tried to put out information that wasn't political, that wasn't conspiracy theory, that was grounded in fact, that came from the federal government, the chief health officer, the state government, the chief medical officer. And we wanted to do our best to reassure our communities and to give them the right information. And I can't speak on behalf of my colleagues in this place, but I can say that as the member for Dunkley, I know that my community valued that, because they tell me almost every day, now that we're out and about, people come up to me and say, thank you for that. And they would be saying it on Facebook at the time and sending emails. And that was about building that trust and holding it gently in my hands, because I've got the privilege of doing it. And that's why members of this place using their Facebook pages to put out what aren't contrary views, but are, as the member for Bowman described it, anti-scientific undercurrents, using their Facebook pages in a time of fragility, a time when people were scared, a time when people were sitting looking at social media to just try to work out what was going on in the world, as a means of building their own profile by exploiting the way those people felt, is wrong. And calling that out isn't, with respect to the member for Bowman, personal attacks on individuals. You know, it's hard to say that this behaviour is wrong without naming the individuals who are behaving in that way. And that's why I have called out the member for Hughes and others and said it has to stop, and that's why I asked the Prime Minister to ask for it to stop, because of the immediate urgent need for it to stop and for public health reasons, but also to be part of a better politics and a better parliament. And it's why I think suggestions that have come from my colleague, the member for Warringah, and others about codes of conduct for parliamentarians, why training for parliamentarians in ethics and understanding that we have competing roles, and some of them are party political, some of them are local political, but a big part of it is being a parliamentarian and is serving the public good, and knowing how to balance them and when to balance them are really important. Because this is our opportunity, And legislation like this that gives us the opportunity to talk about why immunisation is important, we have to grab it and leave a legacy for the future.
The member's time has expired.